last week we got through 3 verses. We're going to get through more than that today, though, so don't worry. We also did the longer introductions last week, which were good. And I am sorry about the confusion with YouTube. So on my YouTube channel, I have a series of videos that I did called The Story of the Bible, which is very related to our topic. So you're welcome to watch those if you like. I also have a series of videos on a virtual tour of the Sistine Chapel, which the Sistine Chapel itself, all the paintings in it, are the story of salvation history. So again, another way to actually kind of get at our topic, which is salvation history. You're not required to watch those, but I will tonight, I didn't do it last week, but I will tonight put these recordings on YouTube so that way, if you miss a week, or if you want to go back to last week, I don't know what I'll have to, maybe I'll just put up I'll just have a generic picture or something of it. Yeah, or Nolan can have it. So anyway, so those are all resources. Like I said, the great thing is they're all related to this same topic, because really what we're studying is salvation history, God's plan of saving His people. Last week, I if you remember, I told you the whole Bible. So this is part of what you'll learn if you go to these videos that I have right now. Every story, right, has a setup, conflict, and then a resolution of some kind. Otherwise, you have to have those things to have a story, right? Well, the setup in the Bible is creation. The conflict is the fall. And then the resolution is all the rest of the Bible. How is that resolved, right? So creation, fall, redemption. I mentioned that last week, right? So the creation is the first 2 chapters of Genesis. The fall is the 3rd chapter. And then the entire rest of the Bible is, how does God fix the problem? How does He resolve the problem, right? Okay. We are going to finish. We're going to finish God's covenant with Adam and Eve, okay? Because we didn't finish that. And then we're going to get into talking about the second major covenant that God makes with Noah, okay? All right, so sound good? Okay, so last week we were in Genesis 1. If you turn your Bible to Genesis 1, and we covered verses 26, 27, and 28. And just as a quick review, remember that the promises that God made in this covenant to mankind. And also remember, too, this is really, really important, because this is going to change after today. This is all before the fall, meaning Adam and Eve are not affected by sin and by concupiscence, which is desire to sin, right? They're innocent. They have original justice, is what we call it, right? So God's promises to them are in this ideal world, this Garden of Eden, right? And so God, this is the only covenant that we're going to have this entire time when we're studying these covenants that is in that pre-fall state. So it's really important to keep in mind. Well, so what does God give? Remember, verse 26, we talked about how God gives man and woman, humankind, dominion over creation. They're meant to be the stewards of creation, who rule God's creation on His behalf and then offer it back up to Him. They are also created in God's image and likeness. We talked about that and kind of what that means. We also talked about how sexual difference is willed by God in the beginning. Man and woman, He created, male and female, He created them. And that is good, and that sex is good. We also talked about how God's first commandment in the entire Bible is be fruitful and multiply. And He was not talking about, He wasn't telling them to plant orange trees and memorize times tables, okay? Have children, right? Life is good, right? And this is all before the fall. Now, these things are all still good. The reason why we struggle with these kinds of things, gender, sexuality, is because we live in the post-fall world. But they're fundamentally good, okay? So those are kind of all the things that we reviewed with the covenant last week, okay? So now I'm gonna read starting with verse 29, because that's where we ended. And I'm gonna read through verse 31, because 29 and 30 are just kind of a reiteration of their dominion over creation, okay? And God said, by the way, I should have mentioned this last week. I'm sure we all have different translations of the Bible. The one I'm using is the Revised Standard Version, Catholic edition. There is no, when it comes to translations in English, this is not the original language of the Bible, so there really is no right or wrong. Every translation has its pluses and every translation has its faults. There is no such thing as a perfect English translation. So when I was taking a course on Genesis, our professor, would have us. He didn't care what translation we used because he would actually have us read out like different translations because it actually can be helpful to have more than one English translation of the Bible. Now, maybe you find a translation that's suitable, and there's also some Bibles that are Catholic translations and others that are Protestant translations. The Revised Standard Version is kind of it's not the one that we use at Mass, but it's a very widely acclaimed translation. But you don't have to use this one. The one we use at Mass is the New American Bible. So I don't know if does anybody else have any other translations that they're using? Or?
Well, not that I had lost my Bible.
I'm more curious than anything.
Well, and I couldn't find it, but anyway, I don't know what I'm
You
looking
got
at.
the here. Let me see. You got the New American Bible. That's the one we use at Mass.
Okay, but I got this in 1983 from my aunt when I had confirmation, and I just realized that, and I was like, oh. Yeah. So, and it's even marked. Isn't that fun? Yeah. So, and
I like I said, I only bring this up just because what I read may not be exactly what you have, but that's not a problem. And actually, if there's something in your translation that is like strikes you as like, oh, that's interesting, that my translation is not the same one, then mention it. Like the translator, because usually when that's the case, it's because there's in this case, Hebrew word that the translators are having to make decisions, The Italians have a phrase like, I don't remember exactly, but it's like, every translator is a traitor. They have a phrase that's something like that. It sounds better in Italian. Because every translator has to make decisions that change not the meaning, but change the word, the way it's presented, the flow. There is no way to get a perfect translation. And so we always have to remember that in English. And then and sometimes when you get into maybe a dispute with someone over some interpretation of the Bible, sometimes you do have to go back to the original language because it could just be you're getting hung up on a word in English that is really not original to the Bible. Most of the Old Testament, by the way, was originally written in Hebrew. Some of it was written originally in Greek, and then the New Testament was originally written in Greek. So that's just kind of a crash course in biblical translation. But I just don't want you to be scandalized. And in fact, if there's a word that jumps out like, oh, that isn't what I read, then bring it up. It'd be interesting to see what other, Obviously the people who did, I would assume, unless you just have some translation that some unqualified person did, all the people, the men and women who worked on these translations, whether they're Protestant or Catholic, are much more qualified than you or I to make those calls on, how to best translate. So anyway, just a side note. All right, verse 29. And God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed, which is on the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. So again, this is kind of just a reiteration of mankind's dominion. But notice that the plants are for food. Not that the Bible is saying you have to be a vegetarian, but there is something about before the fall, there was no violence in obtaining food, even between animals. That's kind of the spiritual point. Now, whether or not animals actually ate each other, that's not really the point. The point is that there was peace. The lion laid down with the lamb, that kind of thing. Whereas you'll see after the fall, killing is involved in the procurement of meat and other things like that. So that's kind of the spiritual point, not necessarily that, and that they were provided for, right? Completely provided for. That, you're in this garden with all these fruit trees and it's as easy as picking it off the tree, You just got to pick the right one, and not the one that God doesn't. There's one tree that you just don't touch that one, and anyway. Okay, verse 31. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, a sixth day. Okay, so all of creation at this point is done after the 6 days. This is another very important verse, just as far as the fundamental Judeo-Christian view of the world and creation, that creation is fundamentally good. It was created good. God created, and then he looked upon his creation and said it was good. And again, that's not an idea that we think, oh yeah, well obviously, no. There are other philosophies and cultures and religions where that is not the case. Creation is a lot of times in other religions and philosophy is some kind of mix of a good power versus an evil power. And then, there's even mythologies where one god splits open the stomach of another god and their guts are what spill out and create. That's a very different view of our inherent goodness if creation is the rotting entrails of a defeated God, or also there's philosophies where there's the principle of light and the principle of darkness, and they have not at all the Judeo-Christian view is that there was nothing, and then God created, and it was good. It was very good. Evil only comes into play when the goodness of creation there's some good that's lacking. Evil is just a lack. I think I mentioned that last week, didn't I? That evil is like a cancer. It's not a positive force, like in Star Wars, where it's like good versus evil, and they're cosmically. No, Satan himself is a creation of God. Now he's not what he should be, hence he's evil. But it's not like Satan is God's equal in any sense of the word. Okay, the only reason why Satan, gets evil to go around is because he tears down what should be there. Evil, another way to say that is evil is a deprivation of the good, okay? Which is a very important thing, because again, there are philosophies and there are religions where, like St. Augustine is a good example. He was a Manichaean. And they believe, or Plato, they believe that matter is bad, spirit is good, right? That's not what we believe. Like matter, physicality, our bodies, right? It's good, right? It's in the post-fall that becomes corrupted and evil, But again, even just the term corruption implies that there's some good there in the beginning to be corrupted. Okay? You see the difference between that as opposed to these two opposing forces where there's good versus evil? It's that evil is where there's a lack of some good that should be there. Okay? All right. So let's go to chapter. We're just kind of continuing the narrative into chapter 2. Okay. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all his work which he had done in creation. Okay, so God does the work of the 6 days, right? And there's the seventh day, which is why we have 7 days in a week, even to this day. This seventh day is extremely important, though, because slaves or, indentured servants, slaves do not get a day off, right? Slaves do not have the luxury of leisure, right? So God isn't just a divine machine spitting out all this creation. He has a day set aside for leisure, rest, to enjoy his creation. How often? So that's part of the reason why God tells us to keep the Sabbath holy, keep the seventh day holy, because we're not slaves and we're not meant to be slaves. Slaves don't get a day off. Okay. We're given the freedom to have a day dedicated to leisure and worship, to enjoy creation, right? We're not just meant to be slaves working 24/7, right? And so it's really important as far as our dignity, again, being made in that image and likeness of God, that we're not meant to just be machines working around the clock, right? So Sunday, which is the day that we celebrate, Sunday is actually not the Sabbath. The Sabbath is Saturday. But why do we celebrate, why is Sunday the day of rest for us? Because of Easter. Yeah, because of Jesus. Yeah, so as great as, and we'll get into this a little bit, but as great as the seventh day was, Jesus rose on not only the first day of the week, but also the eighth day of the week. He went beyond creation to the eighth day to recreate us. That's part of why he rose on a Sunday, right? And so we have a day of rest on Sunday, and we'll get to that later, but I think that it's really important for us to recognize, especially in our world with a tendency to, 24/7 shopping, 24/7, work, that we're meant to enjoy and have leisure to enjoy God's creation because we're not slaves. We're made in God's image and likeness. So what's the first thing of leisure? What's the first and most important freedom that we have that we can do on that day of rest? Worship of God, right? Yeah. Slaves don't get to worship. Pharaoh, originally when Moses wants to leave with the people of Israel, originally all he asks for is not to leave completely, but to go off and worship God, implying that they would actually come back to Egypt. And Pharaoh says no, right? Because they're slaves. You work for me. So worship, right? Well, we go to Mass every Sunday, and the reason why we're supposed to go to Mass every Sunday is because we're called to worship God, to put God at the center, and then let everything else fall into place. But not just that. What else should we enjoy on Sundays? Family, yeah, right? And this is maybe something introspective, is Sunday a family day, We talk all the time about how important our family is to us, but do we actually spend time with them, like quality time, where we put down our electronics, and go to a park or go to a walk, go to a garden, right? Spend time together. Like, again, we're not slaves, and we're not machines. So I think those two things, that leisure of having the freedom to worship God and give him due thanks and praise for his creation and to enjoy and thank him for his creation. And then as an extension of that, our families, Like Sunday should feel like a different day in your household, not just because of Mass, and again, I think for those of us who don't kind of work outside in the field, like doing projects around the house or like gardening together as that's not I wouldn't say like that's a problem, right? That's maybe something you do together, but that it's not just like another work day, or it's not just like a catch up on the honey-do list, Instead of catching up on the honey-do list, spend time with your honey, right? Okay. And I know that's hard, right? But I think we do have to like fight against that in our culture, because it's really easy for us to be consumed and we become like machines, like slaves that are just working around, I'm in a hurry and don't know why kind of mentality, right? Okay? Yeah. You have something to say, Gemma?
No.
Okay.
No.
You look like you have something.
No, the song.
The song. It brings up a lot of memories.
Singing.
Okay. So again, how does Jesus fulfill this seventh day? Well, I already kind of mentioned it, right? Creation takes 7 days. Jesus rises on the first day of the week, which is also the eighth day of the week. So every Sunday we inaugurate a new week, but we also commemorate the eighth day of the week. It's kind of both, right? That while creation took 7 days, the recreation happened on the eighth day. Okay, that'll come up. Have you ever seen, in St. Pat's we actually have this, have you ever seen a baptismal font? You know how many sides are often on a baptismal font?
8.
Yeah, there's 8. In St. Pat's we have it, an 8-sided baptismal font. So it represents the recreation, the new creation. When you're baptized, you're recreated in Christ.
So why is, not that it matters, why is St. Thomas 4-sided?
So theirs
Not
looks like
St.
theirs
Thomas.
actually looks like a tomb. So that those are other like forms of baptism.
Oh, St. Thomas's?
Is
Yeah.
that St. Thomas?
So St. Thomas's, when they designed St. Thomas's, which is actually they designed it to look like a grave or a tomb, to remind you of your death. Because when you enter into the font, you enter into Christ's death. That's the other symbolism with baptism is it's a kind of drowning and then you rise out of the waters to new life. It's actually, so it was kind of an interesting design. I don't know about St. Pius. Maybe it kind of looks like an urn.
Round, isn't it?
It kind of looks like an urn.
round.
I don't know if that's what they were
It's
going
round.
for. But traditionally baptismal fonts are 8-sided. They're octagonal, right? For that reason. Okay. And then also, too, the other thing that 8 symbolizes, so if 7 symbolizes all of time, all of the temporal dimension, the 8th day is eternity. It even goes beyond the constraints of time. We're going beyond time. And that's what Mass is supposed to be, a taste of heaven on earth. And Jesus, in the recreation, unlocks eternity for us. Okay?
I found that I live out by the temple.
Yeah, the Mormon temple.
We're considered friends of the temple because we live within a certain radius of it.
Really? Okay.
Mm-hmm. And so we had a special invitation. The neighbors had a special invitation to go into the temple, and they have a room of mirrors.
Okay.
And it's mirrors on all 4 walls.
Yeah, so it's meant.
So it's like that.
It's meant to be like eternal.
It
Yeah.
reflects.
Yeah. Okay.
It's different. I
Yeah.
mean, and their baptismal font is held up with, I think it's 7 oxen.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
And I don't know
Well,
if
that
it
would
was-
be so. Solomon's temple had a huge bowl on the outside that was on the back of 7 oxen statues. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's probably what that's evocative of. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, all right. So that's kind of the end of the first one. That's where I was going to try to end last week. But okay, now again. So we're not going to go through all of it, but chapter 3. It's not very long, but it's a crucial chapter of the Bible. Is the fall, and really every sin, every kind of sin. It's this becomes the pattern for all sin, right? The temptation, the kind of negotiation. And then not only that, but passing it on to others, right? And then the fall. Okay, so we're not going to go into that. I mean, you're all familiar with that story, but I do encourage you to really read the first 3 chapters of Genesis. Like I said, if you read the first 3 chapters of Genesis, you've got the first 2 plot points of the story, the setup and the conflict, right? But we are going to look at Genesis 3:15. Another crucial, I would say, top 10 verse in the Bible, okay? This verse is called the Protoevangelium, which means first gospel. Okay, so with the name first gospel, you can have the first good news. You can imagine. So there's we're in a fallen world, and then God says this. By the way, he's speaking to the serpent. He says, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." So, in the post-fall world, God recognizes there is going to be this conflict between the offspring of the serpent, the offspring of the evil one, and the offspring of the woman, like the children of mankind, right? There's going to be this conflict, and he recognizes that. But then he says that the seed of the woman and offspring, and it is in the singular, by the way, that a descendant of the woman will bruise the head of the serpent. And imagine, if you step on the head of a snake, it's dead, it's gone, right? While the serpent does bruise his heel. So it isn't the offspring of the woman does suffer an injury, okay? But for the snake, for the serpent, it's mortal. While with the offspring of the woman, it's a bruise. It's a bite on the ankle. So it hurts. It's painful, but it's not death, right? It's not mortal. Okay. So, of course, and again, this is in Genesis. It's the first gospel. It's God saying, yes, there's this conflict now between the serpent and the woman. And remember that in the fall story, the primary Adam doesn't say anything. He's just there. Who knows what he was doing? He wasn't doing his job, right? And that was part of where he failed. Is he was supposed to protect the garden, and he let the snake was in there, and he didn't do anything about it, right? so that, Eve is actually the interlocutor with the serpent, and they're having this battle back. Well, that is going to reverberate down throughout history. The offspring of the serpent, meaning those who follow him and do evil, versus the offspring of the woman. But God gives this promise of ultimate victory by a seed, an offspring of the woman, over the offspring of the snake. Okay, so of course, again, how does Jesus fulfill this? Well, he is the one who ultimately fulfills this, right? Jesus suffers the bruise on his heel, meaning he is crucified on the cross. Extremely painful, right? He suffers. It wasn't just say the word and now everything's hunky-dory, right? He suffers the bruise, but he's the one who ultimately gives the serpent and evil and death the mortal blow, right? And also, we don't have time to get into this, but another place in the Bible where it tells this same story, but in apocalyptic, meaning kind of mysterious language, is Revelation 12, where it's the woman clothed with the sun, with the moon at her feet and the stars above her head, and it talks about this cosmic battle between the dragon and the woman, and the dragon is like waiting as she's about to give birth, and then, when she gives birth, the child is kind of taken up, and so the dragon tries to chase the woman, but then the earth swallows it, or he tries to drown the woman by spewing out water at her, but the earth swallows the water, and then she's taken away to a safe place. It's a different way of saying the sort, and then it ends with, once the dragon realizes he couldn't get the male child, the offspring of the woman, he then does war on the offspring, the other offspring of the woman, the brothers and sisters of the male child, right? So Revelation 12, fascinating chapter, tons of, apocalyptic, mysterious language, but it's telling the same story from the other side, It's telling the same story as Genesis 3:15, right? That the child, the male child a child of the woman will crush the head of the snake, the dragon, the serpent, okay?
So can I ask you, if the serpent was created by God, was this originally set up like a test? So we brought the serpent and the test was...
Yeah, that's a great question. So part of the kind of brilliance of Jewish literature in general is it doesn't give you a ton of detail. It doesn't explain everything, which is an interesting feature of Jewish literature. Notice, in all of the Old Testament, you're almost never given a physical description of any of the characters. You only are if it's really, really important to the story, like Samson and his hair. But you're almost never given those details a lot of times are partly left out because they force the reader to engage with the story. So part of the reason, to answer your question, part of the reason is it is kind of not told. Why is there a serpent in the garden? Obviously, God, creation's very good, but there must have been something that pre-existed even creation, the earth, and it's kind of left as an open question, Now maybe the more as we do theology would be so Satan and his angels were created first, right? And so they're the original rebels, and because they've been cast out of the presence of God, like in Revelation 12, they now make war they can't get at God directly, so they make war on the next best thing that they can, which is his creation that he loves, right? But it is kind of mysterious, and if you didn't have the rest of the Bible, right, you wouldn't know what I just told you. It is kind of left as a mystery. Part of it is because this is just explaining, or trying to explain, the situation that we find ourselves in. We're fundamentally good, but we're also fallen, right? And it's kind of like it or not, that's the world you're born into. And so this story in symbolic language is kind of explaining, how did we get in this situation? God created the good world, but there was some catastrophe to where we're at war with some mysterious force that we can't even always get our fingers on most of the time, right? So to answer your question, part of it is it's not answered on purpose, right, in this narrative. And you kind of need to continue on in the story, and you need to, because you realize, that is kind of the situation that we find. Why is there evil in the world? it's hard to answer sometimes, but it's there. The serpent just appears, So, yeah, it's a great question, though. Yeah. All right. Okay, so anyway, that's so that kind of wraps up Adam and Eve, right? Again, this Protoevangelium, this first gospel, really important because we're given hope by God that God is going to have ultimate victory. Okay, and it's going to have something to do with offspring of the woman versus offspring of the serpent, right? And the crushing of the head versus the bruising of the heel. Okay. All right, so now we're going to move fast forward to Genesis chapter 9. So, in the chapters that we've skipped, basically to make a longer story short, things get worse. Adam and Eve repent. They realize they've messed up, and they have children, but things get worse and worse and worse and worse, all the way through Genesis chapter 11. Mankind, who is supposed to be the stewards of this garden, makes war on each other, on creation, can't get it together. I mean, the second sin is fratricide, where Cain kills Abel, right? Interesting that's kind of the second sin. And things just spiral more and more out of control, to the point where God regrets creating humanity, which is kind of the author's way of saying that it's gotten really bad, and God in his justice is I need to intervene because this is just way out of control, and so so this is kind of the background to what we're going to talk about with Noah. So God threatens to destroy sinful humanity because it's just gotten so out of control, right? That what was supposed to be a beautiful, luscious garden has now become, a place of death and decay and destruction, okay? And crime amongst people, right? Really horrible stuff. So one of the ways to think about the flood is not simply just a punishment. It's also a cleansing. It's you think about all this evil humanity that is now populating the world. Be fruitful and multiply, but they're also multiplying their sins, right? So the flood is also a kind of cleansing, a washing, If you have a dirty plate, you need to wash it in the set, otherwise it doesn't really function well as a plate. Well, the earth has been corrupted by sin. So the flood is a kind of washing, which again is evocative of, or a foreshadowing of, baptism. Right? The flood is a kind of baptism of the earth. God is going to start over and with one man and his family. Now notice, too, there's Noah, his wife, and then Noah has 3 sons, and they have 3 wives. So how many people are saved? 8. You guys do this with your kindergartners, right? Okay. So notice that, the flood, right? The flood, which is a foreshadowing of baptism, and 8 people are saved. There's kind of an echo there, right? With the 8 days of the recreation, right? And also, too, the ark is seen as a symbol of the church. In Michelangelo's painting on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, another thing that you can learn about if you watch those videos, the ark doesn't really look like, in that painting, does not really look like it can float, because it's in the shape of a square with a roof. But part of that is because it's supposed to, the ark is a symbol of the church. In the water, the church brings us to safety, right? The church is God's kind of boat or vehicle to get us through the chaos of the waters of this life, so that we can get to dry land, right? And so forth. And there's also a kind of this idea of, which can be taken out of context by Christians and has been, but this idea of the remnant, that God saves he saves what he can kind of thing. Now there's some Christians who take it out of control and they're like, we're the remnant, we're an exclusive club, and they forget kind of all the other stuff with Scripture. But it is true that not all are saved necessarily, right? That God saves what he can, and that's through the church, which the ark is a symbol of, to get us through the water. So, okay, so when we get to Genesis chapter 9, God is going to make a covenant with Noah. And it's going to be something added on to the covenant he's already made, the promises he's already made to Adam and Eve. So we'll see what that is. First, we're not going to read these, but the first 7 verses of Genesis chapter 9 are basically God reiterates the same covenant. He just renews it with Noah, what he already renewed with Adam, right? So God, who's starting over with Noah, and Noah at this point represents all of humanity that exists, because there's only 8 people that exist now. God is renewing his covenant with Adam with Noah. So in those first 7 verses, he tells Noah, who's also the new Adam, he says to him to be fruitful and multiply, to have dominion over the earth, and he says that you're made in my image and likeness. And he says, therefore, you don't kill each other, because man is made in the image and likeness, right? So he reiterates basically the covenant. So that's nothing new. But even the fact that God is willing to, renew his covenant with humanity, with this new Adam, says something about God, right? Because the original covenant was broken, so he did not have to renew it, but he chooses to renew it, okay? So then we get to verse 8, okay? Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, behold, I establish my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again, so here's the added part, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. So that's the added part, that God, who was, it's not really a correct term with God, but he was tempted to, or he was tempted to destroy humanity completely. He promises here, I will not do that. I will not give up on you. I will try again, right? Now, again, the whole idea of the cleansing of the flood, he could have just started over, but then it wouldn't have been humanity anymore. It would have been a different species, different race, whatever. It wouldn't have been us, right? We wouldn't exist. So he says, I will never destroy you with the flood, meaning what I was about to do, or kind of wanted to do because you deserved it, it's out of justice, I will not do, right? I will try again. I'm not going to give up on humanity, okay? So that's the kind of added part that he makes with Noah. And he says, I'm not going to, particularly that I will not destroy you through a worldwide flood, okay? And so then we get to the, I do want to keep the theme of, how does Jesus, and I've already kind of mentioned it, how does Jesus fulfill this? Well, again, Jesus recreates humanity, right? Through baptism on the 8th day, right? Through the waters of baptism, that's how we're recreated. What comes to fulfillment of this promise, God saying, I'm not going to give up on you, is when Jesus gives us new life in baptism, right? Okay. So now, go back to verse 12. God said, God is going to give a new sign of this covenant, okay? So he says, and God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will look upon it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is upon the earth. Okay, so what's the sign of the covenant? The rainbow, right? We all learn that when we're little, right? But there's more to it than just, rainbows are pretty, right? Think about, if you experienced a worldwide flood where it rained nonstop for 40 days and 40 nights, what would you start thinking if you saw clouds come in? You'd have a little bit of PTSD, right? Like, oh no, here it goes again, right? So when do rainbows appear in the sky? When rains and floods come, right? When clouds start to appear, right? So it's like, again, it's kind of like, oh no, is he going to do it again? Well, no. Okay, there's the sign of the covenant, right, that we see in the sky, right? The other thing, though, too, and this is really fascinating, is the Hebrew word for rainbow is also the same term used for hunting and for like a military bow, okay? So there's kind of two different things that scholars think, is being symbolized here by the rainbow. Either one, God is hanging up his bow, meaning the war between God and humanity, the just war on God's part. God versus sinful humanity. God is saying, I'm going to hang up my bow. I'm not going to destroy you all, right? It's like the bow is being pointed up, like you'd hang your bow on a rack, right? Or the other, and they're not both, they both, probably both, right? The other possible thing that it's symbolizing is that God is actually pointing the bow back to heaven. He's pointing the bow at himself. In other words, God is threatening himself should he break this new covenant with Noah, right? So, one way, again, that how does Jesus kind of fulfill this part of the promise, right? That God chooses to die rather than let us die. Even though we're the ones who keep and will keep breaking the covenant, God actually kind of points the bow at himself and suffers death so that we do not have to, right? Now again, God doesn't actually break the covenant, but he becomes one of us and takes the punishment that we deserve, right? So that's kind of, again, the ancients, if you're looking up at the sky and you see the rainbow, that's what it kind of looks like, right? It looks like a bow pointed upwards. So those are kind of the two things, and like I said, they're probably both right, in terms of God hanging it up, his bow, but also kind of putting a curse on himself, potential curse. Like if I were to break the covenant, this is what I'm pointing my bow at myself. Now he doesn't do that, right? But he does take death in our place, right? So it says something about God, right? That God is even willing to die rather than let us suffer eternal death, right? And then the last part, just to point out with this, is that this is, on verse 16, this is an everlasting covenant. And this is, again, added on to the promises that we've already had. So the promises of, that we had in the first one, being the dominion, image and likeness, be fruitful, multiply, all that stuff. Now it's like God says, I'm not going to give up on you. I will not destroy you, right? Okay? And then again, Jesus ultimately fulfills that so that we can live forever. Right? So, I think that, and hopefully this is part of the point as we go along, right? Is that hopefully this kind of paints, part of what God is trying to paint for us is a picture of what he's like. Because after the fall, what do Adam and Eve and what do all of us tend to do? We tend to hide from God. We're afraid of God because we know he's God and he has awesome power. But God is trying to coax us out, no, this is what I'm like. I'm not going to destroy you. I want to enter into covenant with you again and again and again. I want to enter into a marriage with you, right? We talked about marriage last week, okay? And so that's so part of what, hopefully, through our study, right, is that we're trying to get to know, this is what God is like. And our tendency post-fall is to be afraid of God, but God is trying to show us that, I'm really on your side, and I'm not giving up on you. I'd rather die than have you die, right? And that's what he ends up doing. Not in his divinity, because he can't die in his divinity, but in his humanity when he becomes man, which would have far surpassed anything that Noah could have dreamed of when this covenant was made. Okay? So, as kind of a wrap-up, I didn't really explain this last week, but if you go to the picture on the syllabus there, you see the picture with the kind of... So these are the 6 covenants that we're going to be studying. So we've already done the first one and the second one. But notice how Dr. Hahn has this kind of set up so that as God is expanding, is doubling down and expanding upon these covenant promises, it's kind of getting bigger and bigger. So where he started with Adam as the mediator, and he was a husband, and the form of the covenant was with a marriage. There's only 2 people that existed at that covenant. And then the sign of that covenant is the 7th day, the Sabbath, where God rested. Well, now it's a little bit wider, just a little bit, right? God makes the second covenant with Noah, who's the mediator, he is not just a husband, but he's also a father because he has children. And God is making the covenant not just with a married couple, but with a household, Noah, his wife, and all his sons. Like it's through Noah, he's the mediator, but it's to all 8 of them, right? So it's a household, not simply a marriage. And then the sign of this covenant is the rainbow. And we'll see as we go along that as God is doubling down on these covenants and making new covenants, he's making more and more promises. He's actually expanding the people that he's making it with. Okay? And we'll see that as we go along. So that's kind of just to explain kind of what that little picture is and how you can kind of see, well, you can see where we're headed. But so yeah, that's all I got for today, and we got a minute. But are there any questions or thoughts or comments or Noah's a story that I use as an example of how the Bible is not a children's book, right? Because Noah is actually a very complex character. It's great to teach children, in kindergarten and 3rd grade, like the story of Noah and the animals. But there's a lot more to his story than that, right? And he's a complex. All the characters in the Bible are complex because we're complex. We're good and we're evil. There's nobody in the Bible except for Jesus who is a perfect character. And that's so when we ask, so it's like, well, why do these people sin? It's like, well, I don't know. That's like asking, why do you and I sin? I mean, we're Christians, right? But we sin. It's a complex question, complex reality. We're good, but we're also fallen, right? And so one of the things, and this is hopefully the kind of point of any Bible study, but certainly this one, is that we don't want to stay at a children's level of comprehension when it comes to the Bible. Like God, what is God telling us in all these stories? And it's much deeper than just Noah and the animals in the ark. As nice as that, as important and nice as that is as a foundation, we don't want to stop there, right?